It's like, when you think about freedom shrinking, especially freedoms that people have had to really, really fight for, kind of makes you sit up and take notice.
Yeah, for sure.
And when we look at Taiwan, a place that has made this incredible journey from, really tight control to this vibrant democracy, there's a pretty big question being asked right now. Like, are we actually seeing a gradual erosion of freedom of speech there?
A chipping away at that hard-won freedom. That's exactly what we're going to look at today.
It's not just like some random thought, right? We're diving deep into this because some serious voices are raising this alarm.
Yeah, we've got a really fascinating set of sources that kind of force us to face this question. We're talking statements from political figures, a really weighty joint declaration from a whole bunch of scholars, and even the official position of a major political party in Taiwan. And what's striking is they all seem to be pointing in the same direction.
They're all worried about the direction free expression is headed. So what we want to do in this deep dive is, I guess, untangle these concerns, right?
Yeah.
Help people understand the different arguments being made and give everyone a clear picture of what's actually at stake here.
And do it in a way that's not totally overwhelming, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, no one wants to get bogged down. People want the key stuff, and we're going to guide you through it.
So where do we even start with something this complex?
Well, to really get a handle on these anxieties, we probably need to, I think, start by looking back a bit.
Going back to the journey Taiwan has been on, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, you can't really understand the worries about freedom of speech today without looking at the historical backdrop. We have to acknowledge that long period of martial law from 1949 to 1987 and the era of the White Terror, which was, intense political repression.
It's almost hard to imagine now, right?
Yeah.
The government basically controlled what could be said, written, even thought.
Absolutely.
And they had specific measures in place, like the Taiwan Province Martial Law Period Newspaper Magazine Book Control Measures from 1953. Sounds like something out of a dystopian novel, right?
It does.
These weren't just like guidelines. These were strict rules with real consequences.
Precisely. Any voice that went against the official narrative was silenced, plain and simple.
Anyone who dared to deviate.
Yeah, and people who held views that were seen as, contrary to the government, they faced really serious repercussions.
Surveillance, arrests, imprisonment.
And even execution under these charges of rebellion or subversion.
Yeah, it's heavy stuff.
It created this climate of fear that just suffocated any kind of open criticism. You just couldn't speak your mind.
And that is, I think, the context that makes Taiwan's fight for free speech so powerful. It wasn't just about changing laws. It was about challenging this deeply embedded culture of censorship.
Absolutely.
So how did that shift actually begin? What were those key moments that kind of pushed things forward?
Well, the lifting of martial law in 1987 was huge, right? It was a formal dismantling of some of the most restrictive legal structures. But the real spirit behind that change, the demand for truly free expression, I think that found its most powerful symbol in the actions of Chen Nanjun.
Yeah, his story is incredibly powerful.
It is.
He embodies that longing for free speech in such a visceral way. In 1989, facing prosecution for sedition, he made this incredibly bold statement: "I am a Taiwanese, and I advocate Taiwanese independence." And then he chose to self-immolate in protest.
He was facing charges for advocating for Taiwanese independence, and he chose to make this ultimate sacrifice.
Yeah, his commitment to what he called 100% freedom of speech, it became a rallying cry.
It absolutely galvanized the push for greater freedom of expression. And over time, the legal framework started to catch up with that sentiment. The abolishment of the statute for the punishment of rebellion in 1991, and then the amendment of Article 100 of the Criminal Code. These were massive legal milestones.
These changes really did formally establish those legal protections for free expression, right?
Yeah.
Allowing people to voice their opinions, the media to operate more independently, and crucially, it allowed for that check on government power.
Exactly.
So now fast forward to today. We've had this long, hard-fought journey toward free speech, and now we're seeing these anxieties, these concerns bubbling up again.
Right.
What are the recent events that have triggered this sense of unease, this feeling that maybe those freedoms are under threat again?
Well, one of the things that seems to have sparked this is a statement made by Wu Yuyao. She's a legislator from the Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, and she said this in the legislature. Her words, at least as they've been reported, present a rather, contradictory stance. She said she firmly defends 100% freedom of speech, But then she also said that political speech should be strictly reviewed.
That phrase, strictly reviewed, especially when it's applied to political speech, it does raise some red flags, doesn't it?
It does, especially given Taiwan's history.
Yeah, and the comparisons that some have drawn to the speech restrictions under the Kuomintang during the authoritarian era, even to the current Communist Party, that's pretty striking.
It is. It suggests that there might be this desire to separate general freedom of expression from political speech, implying that the latter could be subject to limitations or scrutiny.
And for people who see the freedom to critique and challenge political power as absolutely fundamental to a healthy democracy.
That's a huge concern.
Absolutely. And then you have this very powerful voice coming from 75 scholars, including Chen Peiche.
Now, he's a really interesting figure in all of this.
Yeah, Chen Peiche is an academician at the Central Academy of Sciences, a respected medical expert, and he also has a history of supporting the DPP.
Right. He was even involved in medical support groups for both Chen Shui-bian and Tsai Ing-wen.
So when he raises concerns, it carries a lot of weight.
It does. His background lends a lot of credibility to the scholars' joint statement. It's titled, "Defend Taiwan's Democratic Rule of Law and Peace and Security."
And the core of their argument is, it's pretty alarming.
It is. They express this fear that the thought censorship mechanism of the martial law era has rapidly descended upon Taiwan's sky, and that freedom of speech is being compressed under President Lai Ching-te's administration.
Compressed by what means, specifically?
Well, they point to the use of populism and anti-China sentiment.
This idea that critics are being branded as pro-China to stifle dissent and consolidate support.
Exactly. They specifically mention the Lai 17 measures, which came out after a national security meeting on March 13th, and these officially designate mainland China as a hostile, what they call enemy.
And the scholars see this as, a very broad stroke that could be used to silence legitimate criticism by basically associating it with this enemy.
Right. It raises a really key question. Where's the line between legitimate concerns about national security and the suppression of dissenting political views?
And then there's this very specific case, the cancellation of the residency permit and forced repatriation of Yaya. She's a mainland Chinese Taiwanese spouse, also an online blogger. And this seems to be a really big point of contention for the scholars.
It is. Their statement directly argues that Yaya's criticisms of the DPP, which she posted online on mainland China's Douyin platform, however controversial they might be, fall under protected free speech.
So they're saying what the government did was an abuse of power.
Yeah, an abuse of administrative discretion and a violation of those fundamental principles of democratic rule of law.
This case really brings those abstract fears about shrinking free speech into sharp focus.
It does. It makes it very real.
And the scholars, they don't mince words, do they? They even draw this stark analogy to Nazi Germany.
They talk about how the suppression of Jewish people and dissidents started with societal silence, and how that silence paved the way for a totalitarian regime and ultimately a catastrophic war.
It's a powerful warning, right?
It is. It's a wake-up call about the potential dangers of staying silent when freedoms are being chipped away.
Even if you disagree with the views being expressed, allowing them to be suppressed sets a very dangerous precedent.
Absolutely.
And then there's this whole issue of alleged self-censorship by the central news agency, the CNA. This adds another layer of concern, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
So the scholars' original press release clearly stated the thought censorship of the martial law era has descended upon Taiwan's sky.
A very direct statement.
But the CNA, when they reported on this, allegedly removed martial law, changing it to this more vague, the thought censorship of the era.
Which is really interesting, right?
Yeah, it feels like they're deliberately softening the message.
It raises questions about the independence of state-funded media.
If they're hesitant to even mention martial law in this context.
What does that say about the current climate?
It does make you wonder. Now, the presidential office did respond to these concerns. They said that any advocacy of aggression, hatred, and violence against Taiwan is not protected by free speech.
And they said that it violates UN conventions and those democratic red lines. So how does that fit in with what the scholars and the Taiwan People's Party are saying?
Well, it seems like the presidential office is saying, look, there are limits to free speech, especially when it comes to national security.
But the scholars and the TPP are saying these actions, like the Yaya case and the alleged self-censorship at CNA, go beyond those limits.
They're saying the government is using this as an excuse to suppress any kind of political criticism.
It seems like the real disagreement is about where that red line is.
Is the government genuinely protecting national security?
Yeah.
Or are they trying to silence dissenting voices? And speaking of the Taiwan People's Party, the TPP, they've also issued a strong statement on this. They talk about this rapid shrinking of free speech under the guise of, anti-China, protect Taiwan.
They also specifically mentioned Cheng Nan-yung and his idea of 100% freedom of speech, emphasizing that even if you disagree with what someone's saying, you have to defend their right to say it.
Which is a very powerful principle.
It is. And they also pick up on the CNA self-censorship issue,
Asking if martial law has become this unspeakable taboo in Taiwan.
which is a pretty provocative question.
It is. It suggests that we might be trying to bury the memory of Taiwan's authoritarian past.
And the TPP is basically saying, we can't let that happen. They strongly condemn any attempt to revive things like the Taiwan Garrison Command, literary inquisitions, thought censorship, or a return to martial law. They even go as far as accusing the DPP of eroding Taiwan's democracy.
Through things like contesting election results, initiating recalls, and these Lie 17 measures.
It's a pretty strong indictment.
It is. It paints a picture of a party that's deeply worried about what they see as this authoritarian drift.
Right.
So we've got all these concerns from different angles. The DPP legislators' seemingly contradictory stance on free speech, the scholars' warning about thought censorship, the Ya case, the accusations of self-censorship, and the TPP's perspective. It's a pretty concerning picture for anyone who values freedom of expression in Taiwan, especially given the history.
It is, and it leads to a really important question. In a truly free and democratic society, how do you scrutinize and counteract potential restrictions on freedoms like speech?
What kind of safeguards should be in place?
We need to think about the role of independent institutions, a free press, and an engaged citizenry in protecting free expression.
It's a powerful reminder that the fight for free speech is never really over.
It requires constant vigilance.
We need to be willing to challenge anything that could curtail our ability to speak freely. So stay informed, think critically, and defend those freedoms.
Absolutely.
They were hard-won, and they're precious.